It began not with a scream, nor a shadow, but a whisper that belonged to no voice, and yet echoed like a memory too old to have form. The village of Lower Delling was not a place of drama or deviation. It lived in routine, thrived on silence, and withered under change. But one evening in November, the bell at St. Crispin's Church failed to ring for evensong, and it was not a mechanical failure. It was, as some would later say, a pause taken by time itself. The villagers noticed, of course, but they did what villagers do. They muttered about weather, shrugged off unease, and returned to their porridge and prayer. Only Mrs. Charity Bell, wife of the Reverend Samuel Bell, said the words no one else would. It wasn't silence. It was waiting. 7 days later, the Reverend was found dead at the top of the bell tower. There were no signs of violence. His hands were folded neatly over his chest, eyes closed as if in prayer, and his body rested beneath the great wooden beam where the rope still hung, swaying faintly though no wind stirred. On the stone wall behind him, just barely visible beneath years of moss and soot, someone, or something, had scratched a message with what looked like a nail or bone. She remembers everything. That was when the letter was sent. A cousin of Miss Jane Marple, who had long served as churchwarden in Lower Delling, wrote to her in a nervous hand. "Something is not right here, Jane. It feels unfinished." 3 days later, Miss Marple arrived. She came with her usual calm, a knitted scarf wound twice about her throat, and her bag containing a notebook, 2 packets of barley sugar, a folded umbrella, and the kind of clear-eyed resolve that had outlasted war, winter, and wickedness. She stepped off the train just past dawn, as the mist still clung to the trees, and the world hadn't yet decided whether to wake or weep. No one noticed her arrival. That was just as she liked it. By midday, she stood beneath the great arch of St. Crispin's bell tower, her hand resting lightly on the worn stone. She didn't speak, not yet. She simply listened. To the quiet, to the church that held its breath, to the whisper beneath the bell that no longer rang. Because Miss Marple knew, better than most, that when the dead go silent, it is rarely out of peace. It is out of fear. The vicarage stood a little apart from the village, framed by yew hedges, and the kind of silence that made a house feel either holy or haunted. Miss Marple arrived on foot, her boots leaving no sound on the moss-soft path. Charity Bell greeted her at the door with a face like marble, beautiful once, now hardened by time and restraint. She wore no black, only gray, and even that looked as though it had been chosen more from duty than grief. "You're most welcome," Charity said, her voice as steady as the porcelain cup she later held with both hands. "I don't believe in fuss." Miss Marple said nothing about the absence of mourning lace or flowers. She noticed instead the stillness in the woman's movements, the way she poured tea as though it were a calculation rather than a comfort. "He was a quiet man," Charity continued, "never one for crowds or warmth. A pause, but good, in his way." Miss Marple, who had long ago learned to read grief not in words, but in what was avoided, simply nodded. She spent that first evening in the Reverend's study. It was a severe little room, heavy with theological texts and tax ledgers, but one shelf stood out, slightly dusted, slightly wrong. There, amid a row of untouched volumes, was a worn biography of St. Agatha. Inside, carefully folded, was a letter. The paper yellowed, the handwriting slanted and precise. To my sister it read, "If I should die, remember what we buried was not truth. It was survival." The signature was familiar. Samuel Bell. Miss Marple closed the letter without a word. When she showed it to Charity the next morning, the widow's hand trembled just enough to betray her perfect stillness. "He never spoke of a sister," she said. "Never." But her eyes flickered, just once, toward the hallway, the one lined with locked cupboards and doors that had not been opened in years. Miss Marple didn't press the matter. Not yet. She stepped outside as the fog rolled in from the sea, carrying with it the faintest sound, like a bell that had been rung long ago and hadn't quite stopped echoing. And from somewhere behind her, in a house built on secrets and sermons, the widow who did not mourn let the tea in her cup grow cold. The vicarage was the kind of place where memory lived in the wallpaper, thick with patterns, faded by years, hiding what no one dared to strip back. Miss Marple had seen many such homes, where every chair had a history, and every mirror reflected something unspoken. But what caught her attention was not the age of the place, it was the contradiction. One wing of the house, the northern corridor, was unusually cold. Not drafty, cold, as though whatever warmth had once passed through it had long been banished. Miss Marple asked no questions of the staff. Questions could startle truth into hiding. Instead, she explored alone while Charity attended to errands in the village. Near the hearth of the drawing room, Miss Marple noticed something odd. A faint ridge above the mantel, where the wallpaper's floral repeat didn't align. She tapped gently, and the plaster answered back with a hollow breath. Peeling away a single edge revealed what the Reverend had hidden, a recess in the wall, and inside it, wrapped in linen, a canvas no larger than a school slate. She unwrapped it carefully. The portrait was of a child, a girl, no more than 10, dark-haired and solemn-eyed. In her hands, she held a silver bell. It gleamed faintly even beneath the grime of decades, its shape delicate, its handle shaped like a flower stem. But it was the girl's expression that struck Miss Marple most. Not sadness, not innocence, something else, something that knew. She traced the edge of the frame with gloved fingers and found initials faintly carved into the wood, E.B. No date, no name beyond that, just those 2 letters and the silence of the plaster that had hidden her for so long. Later that evening, as the sun failed behind the cliffs, Miss Marple asked the maid, Lillian, whether she had ever seen the girl in the painting. The color drained from the girl's cheeks. "No one talks about her," she whispered. "But sometimes at night, when the wind's right, the bell rings. Not the big one, the little one." Miss Marple didn't reply. She simply turned back to the hearth, where the faint scent of ash and old oil still lingered in the air. A child had once lived in this house, a child who had once rung a bell that no longer hung. And perhaps, just perhaps, that child had never truly left. The schoolhouse in Lower Delling stood like a quiet secret at the edge of the village green, all stone corners and damp wood, where echoes lived longer than the children who made them. Miss Marple arrived at the request of Miss Penfield, a teacher with a furrowed brow and a whispering voice, who had sensed something unsettling blooming in the margins of her pupils' drawings. "There's one child," she murmured, Thomas Whitby. Bright, polite, but lately, he's been sketching things a boy shouldn't know." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid the walls might hear. "Things that haven't been spoken aloud in this village for years." Miss Marple sat beside the wood stove while Miss Penfield unlocked a narrow desk drawer and removed a folder of paper. She placed the topmost page on the table gently, as though it might bleed if touched too hard. The drawing was childlike, but unmistakable. The bell tower of St. Crispin's, rendered in cold pencil lines. Snow dusting its roof. A small figure crouched at its base, eyes hollow circles. And within the tower's shadowed upper windows, another shape, slumped curled, with what appeared to be black wings rising behind it. "They're birds," Thomas had said when asked. "The kind that don't make noise. Just watch." Miss Marple studied the sketch. "Did anyone tell him about the vicar's death?" she asked softly. "No," Miss Penfield replied, pressing her fingers together. "He drew this 3 days before it happened." Later, Miss Marple requested to speak with Thomas. The boy arrived quietly, his school shirt buttoned to the top, and a small ink stain on his thumb. He looked at her with wide, thoughtful eyes. "You see things, don't you?" Miss Marple asked gently. Thomas nodded once. "Only sometimes, when it's quiet enough." She leaned in, lowering her voice to just above a breath. "And what did you see in the tower, Thomas?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "A girl with a bell." She dropped it. Then everything stopped. And after that, a man went up but didn't come back down. "Did the girl say anything?" "No, just looked at me, like she was waiting for me to remember something." Miss Marple sat back, her expression unreadable. She thanked the boy kindly, patted his hand, and sent him back to class. Miss Penfield, pale now, stared at the drawing. "What does it mean?" Miss Marple looked toward the school window, where the bell tower stood in miniature on the horizon. "It means," she said, "that some memories don't fade. especially the ones buried in silence. They linger in the cracks of places like this, churches, schools, houses with too many doors. And sometimes they reach out for the only ones still pure enough to listen. She folded the drawing carefully, slid it into her handbag, and rose to leave. Something had been seen, not imagined, and whoever had seen it had not been the first. The train to Devon cut through the countryside, like a whisper forgotten by time. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, watching trees blur into one another, her gloved hands resting atop a folder, the St. Agatha book, the drawing from Thomas Whitby, and a copy of the unsent letter found in the vicar's study. 3 pieces of a puzzle that smelled faintly of laudanum and old stone. The name Abigail Bell had taken time to surface. She was not listed in any parish record under her brother's name, nor in the village ledgers of Lower Delling, but a brief mention in an inheritance notice, filed quietly, almost resentfully, had led Miss Marple to a private convalescent home tucked into the cliffs of Eastmoor Heath. There, under the name Abigail Swan, she had been residing for 17 years. The home itself was a place of soft walls and long corridors, where the air was perfumed with lavender and the past was spoken of only in polite euphemism. Miss Marple was shown to a sunroom with green curtains and afternoon tea laid out in porcelain that had once been fine. Abigail Bell sat by the window, staring not at the sea, but at her own reflection, as if checking to see if she still existed. When Miss Marple introduced herself, Abigail's gaze shifted, slow but sure, and her lips parted into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I knew someone would come," she said, her voice like wind across bone. "I thought perhaps it would be her." Miss Marple took a seat beside her. Abigail did not blink. "My daughter." There was no hesitation in the confession, no fragility, only a clarity that comes when truth has steeped too long in silence. "She was 10 when I lost her," Abigail whispered. "Evie, Evelyn Beatrice Bell. He told me it was an accident, that she slipped in the tower, that the bell rope was frayed, and she tried to climb it like a vine. But that was never Evie. She wasn't careless. She was curious." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "He, your brother, raised her?" Abigail looked out the window again. "No, he buried her." The silence stretched between them like gauze. "I loved a man who didn't wear a collar," Abigail said. "A pianist. We weren't married. My brother," he was furious, "told me I'd brought shame to our name. He gave me laudanum, whispered words like atonement and cleansing. By the time I woke, Evie was gone. He said she'd been sent to a school. Then he said she died. I don't remember which lie came first." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew the folded sketch, the one drawn by Thomas. She placed it on Abigail's lap. Abigail didn't weep, but her hand shook. "She still rings the bell," she whispered. "Doesn't she?" Miss Marple nodded. "I told myself she had forgiven me," Abigail said, tears finally rising but refusing to fall. But she was never angry. She was afraid. Afraid to be forgotten. Afraid to vanish. Miss Marple stayed until the light began to fade. She left the sketch behind, tucked under Abigail's teacup. A small act. But sometimes remembrance is a form of resurrection. On the return journey, Miss Marple did not look out the window. She closed her eyes and replayed a child's face framed in a crumbling portrait, a bell in her hand, her gaze fixed not at the artist, but beyond, as if already seeing the moment when she would disappear and no one would come looking. Until now. The night Miss Marple returned to Lower Delling, the wind carried a strange, thready sound through the village, high, brittle, almost like the singing of wire in frost. No one spoke of it, but windows were latched more tightly, and the bell tower's silhouette seemed darker against the sky, as though it had grown heavier with what it held. Miss Marple did not go straight to bed. Instead, wrapped in her traveling coat and woolen shawl, she made her way, lantern in hand, to St. Crispin's Church. The heavy wooden door creaked open without protest, as though expecting her. Inside, the air was damp and tinged with soot and candle wax. The nave stood in shadow, the pews lined like silent witnesses. She crossed the aisle slowly, pausing beneath the crucifix where the vicar had once preached and offered comfort that perhaps even he did not believe. Then she ascended the bell tower. The staircase wound upward tightly, worn stone steps twisting like a spiral memory. With each turn, the air grew colder. When she reached the chamber at the top, she stopped. Not because of fear. Miss Marple did not frighten easily, but because of what was no longer there. The rope. It was missing. She stepped closer, examining the brass cleat where the bell rope should have been secured. Frayed fibers remained, but the cord itself had been deliberately cut, not torn by age or strain, but with a blade. Nearby, scattered across the floor, lay the remnants of wax drippings and small, glinting nails. Someone had removed it recently, and with purpose. She turned toward the wall, where the words had first been discovered. In the daytime they had seemed like mere etchings, a childish scrawl. But by lantern light, their meaning deepened. She remembers everything. And below them, faint but new, another message carved just beneath. She still rings for justice. It was then she noticed the dust, disturbed, scattered, brushed aside near the stone ledge at the bell's base. Something had been moved, or taken. Miss Marple knelt slowly, fingertips grazing the grooves in the floor. A square outline marked the place where a box had once rested, perhaps wooden, perhaps velvet-lined. The edges were clear, recent, and there, tucked into the far corner of the tower's base, lay a silver locket. She picked it up gently. Inside was a single strand of auburn hair and the initials E.B. engraved in delicate script. A child's keepsake, tucked away beside the bell she once rang. A promise. A marker. And now uncovered. Miss Marple took it with her as she descended. But she did not return to the vicarage immediately. Instead, she crossed the churchyard, the lantern swaying in her hand, until she came to the weathered gravestones near the farthest wall. Some were so worn that their names had dissolved into the stone like old regrets. But one grave stood unmarked, a rectangle of earth that had never been claimed, never had a name engraved. Only flowers grew there, pale pink roses, blooming wildly though the season had turned cold. Someone had visited recently. Someone still came. As she stood in silence, the air shifted. It was not wind. It was weight, like breath held at the edge of memory. From the tower behind her, though no bell rope remained, came a sound, low, solemn, singular. A bell. It rang once, and then fell silent again. Miss Marple turned, her face pale, but composed. Not fear. Recognition. The bell was not broken. It had simply been waiting for someone to listen. Morning brought with it a thin mist that clung to lower Delling like a breath not yet exhaled. The village moved quietly, as if trying not to disturb something fragile that had only just begun to stir. Miss Marple rose early, took her tea with a thoughtful stillness, and placed the silver locket beside her notebook. She had seen enough now to understand what had been hidden and what had been protected. She visited Charity Bell not out of confrontation, but out of necessity. The vicar's widow sat in the conservatory wrapped in a shawl, staring at the frost blooming on the window panes. She did not flinch when Miss Marple approached, nor did she pretend to smile. "There's a grave behind the church," Miss Marple said gently. "Unmarked, but cared for. I believe you know who is buried there." Charity's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "No one is buried there," she said. "That's what I was told. That's what I chose to believe." Miss Marple did not press. She simply placed the locket on the table. Charity stared at it for a long while, not in surprise, but in the hollow ache of recognition. "Evie," she whispered. "He told me she was a lie." "She was his daughter," Miss Marple said softly. "From before your marriage. He sent her away. Then he brought her back, briefly. And then she disappeared." Tears did not come to Charity's eyes, but her voice cracked like old wood. "I knew he was secretive. I knew there were parts of him I was never allowed to touch. But I thought I had chosen silence over shame. I see now I chose blindness." Miss Marple rose, not in judgment, but with the grace of one who had long studied the many ways people buried their own truths. He did not kill her with malice. He killed her with fear. But it was still death. Charity did not follow her as she left. Some silences are earned. Some are endured. Later that day, Miss Marple went to the bell tower again, this time accompanied by Inspector Vale, a quiet man who'd only recently taken over the Delling post, and who carried about him the soft bewilderment of someone who'd walked into a tale half-told. "There's no case," he murmured. "No body. No record. Just ghosts." "And yet," Miss Marple replied, "ghosts are the only ones telling the truth." She showed him the markings in the stone, the hollow where the box had been, and the faint trace of blood on the edge of the bell's inner rim. "It wasn't a fall," she said. "It was a push. Or a blow. The vicar, Reverend Bell, had covered his sin in Scripture, sealed it with silence, and buried it under years of sermons. But conscience is a persistent guest. It had returned in the form of bells that rang without ropes, letters never sent, and a child's grave marked only by roses. That evening, the church held a small service, not for the vicar, not for the widow, but for a girl no one remembered by name, except those who had once tried to forget her. Miss Marple watched as the villagers filed into pews, unsure of why they were there, only that they must be. Lillian, the maid, lit a single candle at the front. Charity arrived late and sat at the back, her hands clasped tightly around the silver locket, and as the final hymn faded, a single bell rang from above. One chime, then silence. No one pulled a rope. No one needed to. The church, at last, had spoken. By the following morning, the frost had thickened over Lower Delling, blanketing the village in a hush that seemed heavier than snowfall, as if the very earth were holding its breath. Yet within the stillness, something had begun to shift, not loudly, not urgently, but like old wood softening under warmth. Miss Marple had taken her breakfast by the hearth, eyes flickering now and then toward the locket on the table, as if it might open again and whisper the rest of its story. But there was something still missing, not in feeling, but in fact. A name, perhaps. A trace. Proof that Evie had been more than a shadow in memory. It was the church warden, Mr. Elliot Greaves, who led her to the records. A man of nervous shoulders and habitual apologies. Greaves had served under 3 vicars and 2 bishops, but never quite believed himself useful. Yet when Miss Marple asked if the vestry kept any private financial ledgers, he nodded without question and retrieved a battered account book bound in green leather, its spine cracking like dried leaves as he opened it. "Reverend Bell's personal entries," he said, sliding the book across the table in the old sacristy. He insisted on keeping a separate one, for things he considered outside parish concern. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, as if listening between each line. Weeks of entries went by. Oil for the lamp, repair for the pulpit rail, flowers for Advent. And then, abruptly, a different sort of line, written in a slanted hand. Special tuition, EB, 3 shillings weekly. The notation repeated, sometimes weekly, sometimes sporadically, for over a year. Then, without warning, it stopped. No note, no adjustment, just absence. "EB," she repeated aloud, those she already knew. "Evie Bell." Mr. Greaves looked startled. The vicar never mentioned, he stopped himself. "I suppose that's the point." Miss Marple closed the ledger with quiet reverence. "Children leave traces," she said, "even the ones we try not to see." That afternoon, she made her way to the old village school, now used only for Sunday gatherings and the occasional book sale. The building had been shuttered 2 years prior, its bell long rusted into stillness. But inside, in a locked cabinet Miss Marple had asked permission to open, were storage boxes labeled by year, each filled with student work, attendance logs, and lesson plans. In the folder marked Classroom 2 to 1958, she found it. A drawing. Childish. Crayon on paper. A tall tower, a girl beneath it in red, arms raised. Above her, a bell with wings. And in one corner, printed carefully in mismatched block letters, EVB. Tears did not prick Miss Marple's eyes. She was not easily moved to sentiment, but she felt the weight of that page, like a hand placed gently on her own. Evie had been here. She had learned. She had hoped. And someone had chosen to erase her. But not entirely. Not entirely. She returned to the vicarage as twilight fell. Charity Bell met her at the door, eyes darker than before, as if her night had been spent in dreams she couldn't quite wake from. Miss Marple said nothing. She only handed her the drawing. Charity stared at it in silence. Her breath caught mid-thought. I thought he told me she'd never been to school, that she was too fragile. He lied, Miss Marple said simply, because the truth was too loud. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Charity reached out, took the paper with trembling fingers, and whispered. I hear her now, sometimes. In the bells. I thought I was mad. No, Miss Marple said softly. You're just listening too late. That night, Charity Bell sat in the church long after the candles had gone out, and as the wind moved through the tower, no rope, no hands, no machinery. The bell gave a single, sorrowful chime. Evie had left her name behind, and someone, at last, had read it. The next morning arrived draped in a pale fog, so thick it erased the horizon and made every shape seem like a memory struggling to take form. Miss Marple rose before dawn, stirred by something more than restlessness, a sensation she had come to trust over the years, a soft internal nudge that said, It's time. She left the vicarage without a sound, walking slowly through the mist-soaked paths toward the churchyard. Her footsteps were muffled, her figure parting the fog like an old wraith come to visit the past. There was a linden tree behind the church, old, twisted, and bowed like a sorrowful sentinel. Beneath it, just beyond the visible row of graves, the grass grew uneven, wild in patches where every other plot was groomed and cared for. Miss Marple paused there, eyes narrowing slightly as her gaze drifted over the stone. Not a headstone, not a marker, just a mound that had settled long ago. She knelt, pressed her gloved hand to the ground, and whispered to no one. You were not forgotten, only hidden. Later that day, she returned with Inspector Vale and Mr. Greaves. She spoke calmly but firmly, requesting, not suggesting, that the unmarked patch beneath the linden be exhumed. It took time, approval, permission from a diocese reluctant to face scandal, but quiet pressure from Miss Marple, paired with the ledger entries and the child's drawing, proved impossible to ignore. By dusk, the earth was opened. It did not scream. It did not resist. It only sighed. The skeletal remains of a young girl lay curled within a child's coffin, wood softened to near pulp, dress threads barely clinging to shape. But there, around the delicate bones of one wrist, was a small silver bell, tarnished and rust-streaked, the same bell from the portrait above the hearth. Evie, no longer lost. Charity Bell stood beside the grave as the workers stepped away. She had not spoken all afternoon, but her silence was no longer tight with denial. It was hollow, like a shell drained of its old lies. Miss Marple did not ask her questions. There were none left worth asking. She was born of shame, Charity said finally, her voice no louder than wind against grass. But she died of secrecy. No, Miss Marple corrected gently. She died of a man's fear. But she lives because someone remembered her name. Charity nodded slowly. I should have asked more questions. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, but asking doesn't always lead to answers, especially when truth is buried deliberately. The next day, a proper service was held. The church was fuller than it had been in years, not from obligation, but from reverence. Some came with flowers, some with guilt, some with nothing but presence. Evie was laid to rest again, but this time not beneath a nameless patch of soil. A small stone was carved and placed. Evelyn Grace Bell, 1949 to 1958. Loved, remembered. Miss Marple stood near the back, beside the linden tree. She watched as the final hymn was sung, low and quivering through the old nave. No bells rang that evening. None needed to, because Lower Delling had already heard the one bell that mattered, the one that marked the end of silence, and the beginning of remembrance. The days that followed were quiet, but not with the dreadful quiet of denial. Rather, it was the kind of silence that arrives after a truth has surfaced, heavy, contemplative, but strangely cleansing, like the hush that settles after a storm finally confesses itself to the sea. Lower Delling moved slowly through its routines. The vicarage remained shuttered, its curtains drawn as if in mourning for a man who had lived as two, the reverend who served the village, and the father who erased his child from history. No one spoke unkindly of him, but neither did they speak warmly. It was as though the village had agreed, without meeting, that certain legacies must not be adorned with false comfort. Miss Marple stayed 2 more days, not out of necessity, but out of duty. She visited the churchyard once more alone, and laid a pale sprig of rosemary beside Evie's stone. For remembrance, she whispered, and meant it in the oldest sense of the word, not merely memory, but restoration. Charity Bell had packed her things. There was no trial, no public inquiry, and yet she walked through the house like one already condemned, not by law, but by her own late understanding. She approached Miss Marple quietly, her eyes softer now, unshielded. "I thought," she began, "that burying her meant ending the sin, that if no one ever knew, it might never have happened." Miss Marple looked at her gently. "But it did happen, and what we bury in darkness rarely stays asleep. It waits, and sometimes it rings a bell." Charity nodded. "I will leave this place." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "but I hope you take her memory with you. Not as shame, as penance." The final evening arrived like a faded page. Dusk turned the sea to slate, and the sky above Lower Delling stretched in long, bruised streaks of lavender and blue. At the edge of the village, Miss Marple stood at the station platform with her hands wrapped around a warm paper cup of tea. Beside her, Thomas, the boy who had drawn graves, clutched a small notepad, his fingers smudged with charcoal. "Will she be okay now?" he asked. Miss Marple looked down at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, because someone like you saw her. That makes all the difference." The train arrived with a soft sigh of brakes. Miss Marple boarded without ceremony, her suitcase light and her thoughts ordered like folded linen. As the countryside slipped past the window, she reached into her handbag and retrieved the old St. Agatha book once again. But tucked within it now wasn't the letter. It was the drawing Thomas had given her, Evie, smiling beside a bell beneath a blooming tree. Back in St. Mary Mead, the frost had begun to settle along the garden path. Miss Marple stepped into her sitting room, lit the lamp with a small click, and placed the drawing beside her fireplace. She sat for a moment listening, not for noise, but for silence. The right kind, the kind that follows peace, not concealment. And somewhere, as the last light dipped below the hedgerows, it seemed a soft bell rang far in the distance, not from fear, nor mourning, but freedom.